All right, folks, welcome back to another moment with Mart. Cheers to you guys. And as we're in the holiday season, I got my tea mug for today. Home is where your mom is. I've been hearing that phrase for a long time. And the place I'm staying at, when we got here, there were coffee and tea mugs, and this one was in there. So dedicate this to all the moms out there, especially as we head into the holiday season. I don't know if that came through elegantly or distasteful. With the sip of tea, it felt distasteful. I thought it was going to be elegant. Sorry. I didn't really plan on that actually, but there you have it. So anyways, welcome to another moment with Mart. I'm excited to have you guys back here again and kind of joining the show. I know last time we talked a lot about Without Words and that book that just came out the other day. December 16th. So Without Words launched, and Mastering the Art of Being, which I have here right to the right of me. And that book, as I talked about in the first show, in the Moment with Mart, is essentially I was kind of diving a little bit into philosophy and the philosophy behind how I wrote that book, and kind of gave you an idea of my perspective towards the vehicle of both the mind and the body, perceiving that as the character in which we play reality in. And what would I say? I don't know if parallel is the right word, but the soul that's inside of that, right? So the infinite part of our soul, the limitless of who we are, sort of the state of nothingness, right? And I touch on that a little bit in the book, is that we kind of have this state of who we are, and it's matched and detached. We're attached to those things, but it's detached with our state of nothingness. So in our places of nothingness, that's sort of where we have our launching pad of intuition, our soul, our understandings of becoming, and et cetera, et cetera. But as the show goes on, and I keep this rolling on and on for you guys, I wanted to kind of start these early episodes kind of creating a foundation, right? And so I know as you guys are following along with me right now in real time, you'll kind of move through it with me. But I kind of want to start, if you were to ever come back to this or hear the beginning stages of the show, and kind of when I first started launching it, I wanted to create a baseline and a foundation for sort of understanding a lot of where my work comes from, a lot of where my perspectives are formed from. And I think that if I can do that decently enough to give you guys an understanding of where my frame is from, how I see the things, then I think that the way in which I receive questions from you guys and how I answer them, or how I ask for your feedback or your answers to questions, or even asking for questions, I think it can sort of create an ongoing conversation, but then it can create the space needed to sort of meet each other where we all need to be. And I think that that's the beauty that happens in Q&A, right? And I've said this in the first show, I believe, but if I didn't, I'm going to say it probably a lot, quite frankly. But questions are really, really important to me. I think that questions are the gateway to understanding, the gateway to conversation, the gateway to evolving, adaptation. And like I said, I thought I might have said this, but the format of question, from what I really like, I like taking the theory from the ancient Greeks and the early philosophers, of their perspective towards having questions that were so large enough or so big or so profound that we couldn't answer them, and kind of seeking frustration in our answerless, limitless and answerless answers to questions, I suppose. And that is obviously why I titled the last book that I wrote, or the most recent book that came out, Without Words, because I think that it's easy to justify everything materially with words, and to be able to put ourselves in a position where we are without words is sort of the point in understanding our essence, and sort of the point in becoming more of who we are. And even as I say that, I think of a concept such as love as a wordless description, right? I've always found this, and I would love your guys' thoughts on this too, I was married a few years ago, and I'm in my mid 30s now. And I think you kind of go through your 20s, your later 20s and your early 30s, getting invites to weddings, right? It's sort of the time in your life that people are getting married and doing those sorts of things. And something that struck me as unique early. Now, I obviously have a better understanding of love in the material sense now, and how we justify marriages and relationships defined through love, and the point of it being about love. I get that. And I've understood a little bit more about the traditions, and I've been to some unique weddings that are very traditional and all kinds of things. I just went to a Persian wedding a couple months ago, and I thought that was really unique. Obviously, I've been to a lot of Christian and Catholic masses and weddings because of just my background and where I grew up. And I've seen different styles. I've seen holistic sort of weddings that are kind of off the cuff, and sometimes you have a preacher or an ordained friend, those sort of things. And whatever, people find different ways to get married. But one thing that stood out to me when I was younger, when I first started going to weddings, was I always thought it was interesting to hear people say their vows to each other, because they would read, and it's beautiful, not discrediting that, but I always found that as a unique thing to think about words and how we try to define things that I don't think you can define. I don't think you can define love, because even if I try to tell you what love is, or you try to tell me what you think love is, I don't know if we would get there, because it could go deeper. But when it gets deeper, it gets quieter, and it gets less and less easy to explain it. And it becomes, I don't know if abstract is the right word, but it becomes nothingness at a certain point when you get to the depths of it. But that's what I think makes it so beautiful. So back to the vows. When I was younger, I'd go to weddings. I remember one of my friends got married when we were like 21. I was so naive and oblivious to these things at this point. But they said each other's vows, and they just read off what they loved of each other. And I don't remember what they said, but it was just like a weird moment for me. I was always confused if I would ever want to do something like that. And then I got to be like my mid 20s, and I saw this, and I knew the people a little bit better, and I kind of saw them do that again, and I still felt weird towards it. And where I'm getting to is that when I had my moment of deciding whether or not I would do that at my wedding or not, we had decided not to. And one of the things that I was really grateful that my wife and I agreed on not saying those things in front of people, is because I don't know how to express or define the depth of love, and especially in that moment. Now, I think that materially it's a cool thing to do for people who have traveled to see you, or family and friends. And I think it's cool to hear someone tell you something they love about you. I just don't know if we can get there. I don't know if we can get there through words. I think that's too deep. And so that's kind of, again, without words. And the chapter 2 of my book, Without Words, was called Abstract God, is called Abstract God, because I think we do a lot of that in our faith as well. It's so deep and so powerful and so profound, and it's so simple, but it still exists in a state of nothingness. And so we try to define it for our materialistic side and our needs of certainty, but I don't think we can get there. And I think that those frictions of not being able to describe things or justify things is perfect as we want, I think, is the point, because I don't think they need to be or should be, but we as humans try to make them be that, right? So enough about Without Words, because I'm going to talk about that a lot. There you have it again. And a lot of my perspective has been painted through the content in that book. But the book I wrote before that, and something that I think is more tangible, more with words, is Breathe, Focus, Excel. I wrote this a couple years ago. I think the makings of this book was in 2021 is when I started the research for it. And I started writing it in 22. I don't remember, but I have no idea. I might start writing it in 2020. It came out in 2023. This started in January 2023. So coming up on about 2 years now is when it was published and brought out to the public. It was a book that I started I started researching it really in 2015 when I got into breathwork and breathing and, and a little bit of health and holisticness through nature, and my perspective on what health is and the living in accordance with nature and those sort of things. As the story goes, in 2015, I was released from professional baseball. I'd been playing professional baseball at the Milwaukee Brewers for a few years, and I had performance anxiety at that time. And I was going through some physical injuries as well around my back and my hip and kind of up into the shoulder and the elbow. I'd had an elbow surgery a couple of years prior. But one of the things that was really struggling with was mentally. I was just felt really frozen. I felt really anxious. I was just really depressed, especially after I got released. I was just in a really unhealthy position. And in 2015, I dove into breathing as a modality for my own health. And I sort of took that full tilt and challenged myself with cold exposure to stress my breathing and to stress my nervous system. Now, at the time, was I as equipped, I guess, in understanding some of these things? No, but that wasn't the point. And I wasn't seeking to write a book about breathing. I was trying to sort of rewire I'm trying to speak as it was 2015, but now I kind of have a better understanding of what was happening. But I was trying to rewire my physiology at the time. I was trying to rewire my nervous system. I was clearly in a very chronic, sympathetic fight or flight state, which I don't think is. I've worked with professional athletes for almost a decade now, and that's not unique in professional sports. You find that a lot in business as well, and performance, and anyone who is really pushing the pavement is really trying to accomplish or achieve, I suppose, things that like really fine detail, really is trying to get as close to perfection as possible in their performance, or trying to get as much out of them. And there's a lot on the line of that, whether that's public status, whether that's money, businesses, management, all that stuff. A lot of times people will tend to find themselves in a chronic state of fight or flight, or an acute. It starts out acute, obviously, but then it becomes chronic, and that's where you see suppression of a lot of things in the nervous system, and not really able to express yourselves, or not really aware of who you are, or aware of your identity. You just kind of lose touch with yourself a little bit. And eventually that suppression will break, right? That'll turn into mental, physical, emotional injuries. And in sports, a lot of that happens a lot because of injuries. It's easy for me to speak on sport, and I think that physical injuries get highlighted a lot in sport because we watch sports. And a lot of times when you see people get hurt, it didn't happen at that moment. Now, there's obviously fluke injuries, someone getting hit or spraining an ankle or whatever, something that happens, in an instant, but something that kind of comes and occurs over time. There was eventually some acute thing that took place, and there was a suppression of that, not acknowledging the symptoms of that, and that eventually becomes too big for the person, and that'll become an injury. For me, I would say I was suppressing poor breathing mechanics and poor breathing understanding that was disrupting my physiology, and the disruption of my physiology was probably acute, if I were to guess. And I've done a lot of homework on myself here, but I breathe through my mouth unconsciously. I have been working on my jaw and my teeth for the last couple of years, but I created a crooked teeth growing up. My lower jaw drops back a little bit, and I'm a little bit gummy on the top of my teeth, and all of that stuff creates mouth breathing. You become a mouth breather. And this occurs for numerous reasons. I mean, there's a book in the book of, I can't remember the author, but the book Jaws, there's a really cool book. It's literally just called Jaws. And it's about human jaws and human anatomy, and how the anatomy has sort of devolved over the last couple hundred years. And a lot of that has been due to our processed foods, the amount of sugar that we have. A lot of it has come about from industrialization and us moving indoors. It's become because of our sedentary lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a lot of reasons that have devolved the jaw and made us weaker breathers. I think I was just a byproduct of a lot of scenarios, and you can even see pictures of me as a younger kid sleeping with my mouth open. I was a snorer. I had strep throat all the time. I had allergies. I went through a lot of significant issues there, and I just sort of suppressed that for a long time. And then when I got into college, I had a couple injuries that kept me in college for 6 years. So I was in college a little bit longer than normal. And then I played 3 years professionally. So that's almost 10 years of what I consider competitive sport. And in 10 years of competitive sport, you're pushing it constantly, right? And obviously I wasn't unique in the way in which I lived. I was very artificially driven through uppers and downers. I was very aggressively using pain pills. I was using uppers in terms of a significant amount of Red Bulls and caffeine drinks and pre-workouts and all sorts of things, right, to try to upregulate my body. And then I drank heavily, and I did things that I could kind of downregulate and be able to go to sleep. And obviously this led into even sleeping aids and all kinds of things. Basically what it was an artificial way to cope and regulate the nervous system. And again, I've been in pro sports for over a decade now, and I've been in since college. I'm almost 20 years I've been in competitive sports. If you want to consider Division I sports a division, I played Division II for 2 years. If you want to consider that area, I'm almost at 20 years of being in this environment, and I'm by no means was I unique, or am I unique in those decisions or that system. In fact, it's almost the conformist. It's the normality of that lifestyle. That lifestyle ended up coming to crush me at the end. And that was largely what I believe ended up giving me an anxiety in my performance. And where I wrote this book, where I became into breathing heavily in 2015, where I do a lot for a living now, and what I have done for a living for a significant amount of years now, around physiology and training the nervous system and teaching people tools to essentially be able to regulate their state. A lot of that was driven by the demise of my personal career. And my personal career was highlighted through coaches and even myself. When you think of anxiety, you think so much of it is in your mind, which it is, because that's how you're perceiving reality, through our thoughts and our mind and our energy and what we can kind of hold on to in our brain. And so that's where it gets lumped into, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's just where we were working at the time. We were working a lot on my mind. And I definitely think that I'm still prone to that in my thoughts, just like anybody else. I would consider myself someone who thinks often. I'm not going to say I'm an overthinker. I think that has a negative tone to it. I don't think I'm an overthinker. I think often. I enjoy thinking. And when I thought often negatively and had anxiety on top of that and feelings of frozenness and was sick often, that showed up in my sport as what's called the yips. And the yips is where you essentially lose your ability to perform. For me, I just could no longer throw a baseball in a strike zone. I mean, I could throw a ball physically, but I wasn't going to be able to have the skill set to be a professional baseball player. It just it was not going to happen. I could not throw a ball anywhere in the vicinity of the strike zone. And as that got worse and worse, clearly I started to have I went from like a hyper aroused state to a hypo aroused state. And that's where you kind of go from this over anxious, hyper aroused, as you can imagine, like very tight, frozen feeling. And then you become hypo aroused, which is more of that like low, depressing feeling. And that didn't really come until the end of when I was playing. But when I was done playing, I was in search of anything that I could really do to get me in a position to be healthy, right? And how could I overcome this? And I was really wanting to do it naturally. I don't know how that came to me. I just knew then that I believed that I could do things naturally. I was obviously in positions where I was told and was guided to take certain pills and antidepressant pills and anti-anxiety medication and those sort of things. I just didn't, and I don't care to go down that realm either. I just, for me personally at that time in my life, I just wanted to see if I could go without it. And I wanted to see if I could move through it without it. And so breathing was what was offered to me. It was the thing that was calling to me. I had met somebody who was able to help me, and this guy and his partner were able to kind of teach me a lot of things. They took me to a lot of things that like I said, I do now. I mean, they introduced me to sound bathing. They introduced me to saunas. They introduced me to cold exposure and introduced me to breath work. And I started with breathing as the foundation. I stuck with breathing. I stayed there, and I couldn't stand the cold, but I tested myself in it for a little bit. And I just had set a goal that winter in 2015 to swim in the lakes of Minnesota. And when it was kind of freezing over and there's that cold winter time, if you've ever been to Minnesota, it's cold. As far as I'm concerned, I lived in Michigan for my whole childhood. I lived in Ohio for a little bit. Minnesota's the coldest place in the world. It's gotta be colder than the Arctic Circle. I don't know how. It just is so cold. And I still took on the challenge of being able to swim in the lake there, and I did it, and I felt really good. And that water just changed me. I mean, I talk about it a lot now. I don't feel as connected 10 years later to that moment. I've told that story so often for certain scenarios like this podcast or podcasts I've been on or interviews I've done, and obviously that story gets highlighted a lot, and it's fair that it does. It was a beautiful experience in my life, but for me, my relationship to it is the story at this point of something that occurred that I remember. But the moment that I was in the ice and the water, it was magical, and it was really monumental for me to be able to control my nervous system and my breathing and my mind and my thoughts in a really dead of winter sort of scenario in Minnesota. And when I got out of that was when things clicked for me. It sort of pushed me into this rabbit hole of trying to understand what that was. Even at this time, I didn't even know the word physiology existed, really. I'm sure I did, but I don't remember it. I don't even know if I knew what a nervous system was or what parasympathetic or sympathetic meant, but I knew that it felt good. And I knew that it made me feel something, which I hadn't felt in months, really. And it just kind of did something. It kickstarted my engines, and it kickstarted a curiosity. And so I took that pursuit for the next couple years, and I studied, and I met people. I went to retreats. I met with doctors. I did lessons, and I just sort of followed what I was feeling, and I followed the what would that be, the path, but I want to say something better than the path. No, I shouldn't say better than the path. I want to say something like cards left. We'll call them crumbs. There we go. Which is probably simple. I was following the crumbs, and as I followed the crumbs, I started to understand where they were leading me to, and where they led me to was the awareness or the philosophy that our psychology is a byproduct of our physiology. And I think that we're physiologically perceiving the world around us through our senses in real time all the time. And I think that when we are physiologically sound, we have the ability to control our state. We can upregulate, downregulate. And I think that once we have the ability to control our state naturally, now all of a sudden we start to create this space in the mind. And where I talk about space in the mind is you essentially get to develop a bigger container to handle the stimulus of the world. And when the stimulus of the world is occurring around you, it doesn't mean you're exempt from stimulus and stress. No chance. What it means is that your container can handle the stress, and you're not reactive in the stress. You're not emotionally reactive in the stress. You're responsive to it. You can respond to things that are happening to you. Now, is this perfected? No, but I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to learn the practices of natural state controllers, we'll call them, and give yourself the ability to build a bigger container so that you can experience life not with anxiety. And as you experience life without anxiety, you get to expand not only yourself, you get to dive into who you are, and you get to bring your unique gifts into reality. And I think that's going back to the original, or the book I just released, Without Words. At the end of the book, I talk about the point of the calling, meaning our unique gifts from God that we're here to give to the world. And I think that that's the play that we all have. I think that we're all unique in that aspect, and the ability to really hone in on what makes you unique is the gift, and it's a lifelong pursuit. And the ability to get more of that out of you is to have a container, and you don't want to be limited in the space in your mind, or you're going to be anxious. And when you're anxious, you're constantly living in this survival state. You're just always trying to survive. So that doesn't leave opportunity for you to thrive, if you will. Thrive. It doesn't leave opportunity for you to build things and create things. And I think that largely the point of the prefrontal cortex, the problem solving part of the brain, is to get us to solve problems and critically think and get deeper into what consciousness is. And I think that our ability to connect interconnectedly globally, whether that's globally for sure, I think that there is an opportunity to globally connect consciously, but I think that you can do that in your communities, in your families, your friends, yourself, the people around you, and it allows you to have a better grip on who you are without words in society with words. And breathing is a really amazing gateway to expand that container of yourself. So not keeping it on a philosophical sense of without words, looking at a more tangible sense of breathe, focus, excel. This book is largely, it's based off of scientific principles and things that are tangible and objective and are real to do. And there is a lot of literature. Human Kinetics they published that book, and they're a phenomenal company in the educational world, and they're very tough. They're very strict on making sure that things is credible and things that they are used appropriately. And I think, and they were on me aggressively. I mean, trust me, there were tons of times where I was trying to get off the beaten path and do my own thing. And they were just, come back over here, Harv, and getting me more in line with research and literature, which is beautiful. And I think that a lot of that helps with the tangibleness of reality and the materialism of where we're headed, because a lot of people don't want to hear, that's great, Harv, but how does that help me, right? When people ask me, and they've asked me this for over a decade, when people want things to help them, they want protocols and tangibleness. And that's what you even want as you listen to me. You can hear my story, and sure, there's an emotional side to it. And you maybe like that story, and you think something different of me, or you're neutral, or you're turned it off already and you've moved on with your life and you're not listening anymore. And all those scenarios are just how you interpreted how I talk, and I'm interpreting my story. I don't even know how true my stories are, right? And I've talked about this in the first thing. I don't know if anything that I say is true, and I just hope that it helps myself and you guys think, and we think deeper and better together. But as far as truth goes and interpretation goes, I don't know how accurately we interpret anything similarly. But when you're creating a book and you're trying to give protocols to people, you're trying to simplify things to make them as tangible as possible. Now, as a coach and as someone who's taught a lot of people over the years, is that it's a bummer when someone gets obsessed with protocols. That's a bummer. That bums me out. It bums me out when it needs to be so tangible and objective, because then you just become a slave to material, and you don't explore who you are, I don't think. And I don't think I can give that to you. And I don't think I even have a position of being right to tell you you're not doing that. I just think it's a bummer when we just become obsessed with tangible things and protocols. So I do say that as a, I don't know if that will makes you want to read this book any more or less, but there's a ridiculous amount of protocols in there. And I think that they should help guide and create a deeper understanding through some knowledge of breathing and physiology and how our nervous system works, and the anatomy of our body and the anatomy of our diaphragm, and the way in which we move based off the way in which we breathe, and the way in which we think based off the way in which we breathe. But my suggestion would be to take tangibleness things from this book to build yourself a base and a foundation, and then to get away from that and get deeper into awareness and understanding yourself. I know that I'm going to talk about questions tonight. Let me see if I can get a smoother T sound here. It's nerve-wracking to drink tea in front of cameras. That's better. I don't know if you can hear the gulp. Everything when you have headphones on was my favorite part about podcast and shows. I want to call it a show. My favorite part about the shows with headphones and mics and everything is when you put these on, you feel like you're in something else. It's so cool. It's always been like that. I know people do podcasts without headphones on. I don't know if I would like that, because when I have these on, I feel like I'm in my zone. I got my uniform on and I'm playing, and it just sounds different. It just sounds like I'm somewhere and I'm with all of you guys. I don't know how to explain it. I think if you've podcast or been on the radio or anything like that, you would know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so when I have that tea and I drink it and I gulp, it sounds really loud going through the mic. And I know I've had teas with people in real time without mics and headphones, and it doesn't sound that loud. So hopefully you guys didn't hear that. And if you did, I hope it sounds pleasant. Anyways, back to breathing. And I'm going to get into some questions tonight, but I want to just hammer out some breathing education real quick, and then we'll move into the question phase, and then we'll call it a show, and we'll keep moving forward. I appreciate you guys being a part of this with me. So breathing wise, this is the one thing, and again, we'll dive into that book in future shows. But for me, the first three prongs, if you're thinking about breath work and you're thinking about your own life in your own sense of breathing, or you're trying to help somebody or teach somebody, or you're a breath coach or any coach, really, strength coach, baseball, football, hockey coach, whatever. Breathing, in the way in which I've come to understand it, is it really comes into, it's like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs deal, right? Or the food chain, where you have the food pyramid, and it's coming up. The base of your pyramid in breathing would start with mechanics, and above the mechanics would be your physiology, and above the physiology would be your psychology. That would sort of be your pyramid. And I don't think that we get to our psychology without our physiology, and we don't get to our physiology without our anatomy. And so if our anatomy can be somewhat proper or move fluidly for us, now all of a sudden we're in a position where we're moving soundly, and the movement of the diaphragm in a healthy sense, it sort of massages and sings to our physiology. So you see I'm working myself up the chain. So once I get myself to that physiological state where I feel like I'm calm because the diaphragm is working the way it should, now all of a sudden the physiology runs up the brain, and it sells into the brainstem, and it says everything instinctually here is feeling safe, and I am calm, and I am healthy. And all of a sudden that kind of quiets your limbic system, which is your emotional center. And as the limbic system is quieter, then you have access to the prefrontal cortex. That's that container I'm talking about. You don't have that friction before. There it is. You hear that through the mic. You don't have that friction from the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. In fact, there's a really cool saying of limbic friction. I'm not familiar with who I heard that from, and it might be well known, but when you have limbic friction, that's essentially meaning that you don't have space in the brain, and your limbic system is starting to enter into the prefrontal cortex, and it's going to rip problem solving and rational thinking from you. That's where you become reactive. So if the senses get a sound, traffic, for example, or a loud sound, or there's too much stimulus, or poor food, or you're in an overpopulated area or air polluted area, now all of a sudden the brainstem, which is your instinctual centers, with your sympathetic, parasympathetic, that will get essentially bugged out, and it'll just go into your limbic system, and you'll kind of have this emotional breakdown or this reactivity. And I think you see a lot of that with kids because they're not as communicative, especially obviously babies and development years of the consciousness and the way in which the brain's formed. I think you're just seeing a lot of emotional responses to feeling and to You're seeing emotional responses into sensory input and the way their senses are perceiving the moment. So if baby feels hungry, baby cry. Baby not hungry, baby doesn't cry. It's the same thing with animals. You see it with dogs a lot. You see dogs who are just sleeping, they're in parasympathetic. Now all of a sudden they need to pee, and they get up and they just start clawing at your legs, and they go out and pee, and they want you to throw the tennis ball to them until they get tired. And what does the dog do once it gets tired? It tells you it's tired through its breathing. It's essentially starts to mouth breathe, the tongue falls out. And with my dog specifically, you can always see its tongue get white. And then what does the dog want following that? Is it's got a dry mouth, it's panting, it's over breathing, it's mouth breathing. It just wants water so it can get some saliva in the mouth, which is a parasympathetic tone, which is an adaptive state. It's a relaxing state. It's what builds your container. And once that animal gets into that state, they go back into nap mode and they close their eyes and they go to sleep. But they don't have the thinking capacity that an adult human has. And the difference between the dog in that scenario and the human is that the human doesn't turn off thinking how dogs do, because dogs aren't as conscious. They're not in that prefrontal cortex lobe like we are. They're not solving problems and building skyscrapers and running businesses. They're just surviving. So they're living so much off instincts, and they're basically moving throughout their days on the way in which they're feeling. And that's just a good example. So if we're trying to work from the bottom up and we're trying to have access into better, deeper thinking, better psychology, well, then we want to start mechanically with our breath, and we want to be able to move the diaphragm. So when you're thinking of the diaphragm is real simple. As you're sitting, laying, standing, as you're listening to me, the diaphragm sits in your rib cage underneath your lungs like an umbrella. It's kind of folded up like this. And when you inhale for those lungs to expand and get bigger, the diaphragm pulls down more towards your pelvis, and it flattens like a Frisbee. When it flattens like a Frisbee, as you guys inhale, you can kind of feel your ribs go out wide and they'll lift at the end, but that's opening up space for that diaphragm to flatten. And as that diaphragm flattens, you kind of get this 360-degree, I call it like a safety belt with that Frisbee style. And it wraps around into your back and your intercostals, which is the side of your ribs and the front of your ribs. And when that occurs, you've had expansion. So you've been able to breathe horizontally rather than vertically, and into your chest and into your shoulders and into your neck. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the future, about the disconnect that we have when we breathe mechanically on sound, because we're using different parts of our lungs. We're getting less blood exchange, less oxygen CO2 exchange. And it turns on a cascade of events of negative feedback loops into our brainstem. So that's the first thing about breathing, is can you just be able to breathe in and out through your nose and feel your ribs go out horizontally and then come back in and down. You can feel that when you breathe. When you inhale, you should feel your ribs come out, then they'll come up slightly. When you exhale, they'll kind of go down and in. And that's a really cool awareness point to learn about the way in which you breathe. Expand, bring them back down, right? And that's a key indicator of using your diaphragm. The nervous system is, just think of the spinal cord that hangs from your brain, right? And as it hangs from your brain and the diaphragm is able to move and get full expansion, now all of a sudden it like waves your nervous system like a wind chime. Your wind chimes, when you hear wind chimes outside your back door and they're going crazy and haywire and all over the place, you know that storm's coming through. But the wind chime is calm and it's quiet and it's super relaxing, and you're not really thinking or stressing about what's happening outside. Your nervous system kind of works the same way. When it's getting overworked, over-breathing, overstimulated, the wind chimes are going crazy, and it's saying that a storm is headed your way. And that's when you're not going to think creatively, because you need to go find shelter and survive. Well, the physiology does the same thing for us. So when we can breathe slow and quiet and rhythmic, then all of a sudden we tell this nervous system, we just kind of, it's like a string. We don't play it that loud. And we don't play it loud, it shoots up into the brainstem and says, I'm safe here, I'm protected. That'll take the limbic system, it'll take the friction away from the prefrontal cortex. All these words, sorry. And you'll have space. You'll build a container. And that's when we access psychology. And that's why I think when I come back to the full end of that story, to me, it's physiology first over psychology. You are accessing your brain and your thinking states through your body. And the unconsciousness of our body, our autonomic systems, our heart rate, our blood flow, our organs, all the ways in which we function Breathing, we can make conscious. That's where it becomes our superpower, is that we can make that conscious. Okay. So I hope that helps. It's a little bit of education. I'm going to do one more tea thing just as I get into these questions. So hang with me here. Let's turn off our brain towards breathing and let's dive into questions. There we are. So question came in from my buddy Nick McCoy, and Nick McCoy is from San Diego. He is a good dude, played baseball with the Yankees. He was in the Yankees organization for a little bit. I think he scouted with the Angels for a bit. He played college baseball out in San Diego. I've known Nick for a few years now, many years actually. I maybe consider it that. He's a really good friend of mine. I think Mitch Bauer out of Minnesota was my last question on the last show. But Nick's question comes to us today, and I know he thinks a little bit how I do in the sports world, but to him the question is, I'll read it how he wrote it, is spectacular versus consistent. Do we feel society, in quotes, overvalue the spectacular relative to the consistent? With that, is it possible to embody both? In other words, if the aim is optimal expression, is it better to be spectacular or consistent? Now, I know he's asking me this directly, so I can take this for a second, but the last part of this question is, how does this resonate to high performers? So let me start with, how does this resonate to high performers before I go into the other questions, so that, because I know not everyone listening to this is in the sports world or likes performance coaching or those things like that, but I also know there's athletes who listen to this and there's performers who listen to this. And so I'll answer this from that point first. So how does this resonate to high performers, spectacular versus consistent? Well, I think it's pretty simple in my mind, because I'll use baseball first, and then I'll use somebody who's not in baseball that comes to mind when I think of somebody that embodied both, which was the second part of Nick's question. But as far as I'm concerned, spectacular in sport, or how it relates to high performers, is I think that everyone clearly wants to have spectacular games every night out, 100%. I think anyone who's played professionally clearly knows how important it is to be consistent, because largely, especially if you look at some of the contracts around Major League Baseball right now, the ones who are getting paid have been rather consistent. So that's something to think about. I think there's two aspects of being consistent. One is you are sustainable. You're going to show up. You are going to be consistent, and you're healthy. In any aspect of the world and anywhere that we work, when you're healthy, you're useful. So people who are useful tend to get paid in sports. And so I think there's a lot that happens with consistency. Now, if you're spectacular and you're consistent, then you get paid. In baseball specifically, when I think of that question, if I can think of it in both sides of it, I think that you can think of the player who has a spectacular outing, meaning you have the pitcher who maybe is 25 years old and he's been in and out of the minor leagues, and he's not really going to make it that long as a Major League Baseball player, but he's going to have a chance. And in that chance, he throws a no-hitter and he's famous for a day, right? Or a couple days, and he's on ESPN, he's blowing up virally on Twitter, and everyone's talking about him. He's getting interviewed, and all these things are happening because of his spectacular outing. But if there's only one spectacular thing that happens, not many of them, or there's not much consistency, that player's sort of still going to maybe go back into the minor leagues and be done playing soon. But he had a spectacular outing, and we remember him for that. Then there's the baseball player who plays 12, 13 years, and you don't really know about them, but they're consistent. Maybe there's a backup catcher, somebody who's just been able to make their way around the leagues as a good teammate. Potentially they've been clutch, but they can play and they're healthy and you can count on them. And I think that both are beautiful stories, and they're beautifully, they complement each other for sure. And I wouldn't say no one, especially in the examples I just gave, I don't think anyone's trying to not have those aspects. But I think what happens when somebody embodies both, you get something like the Michael Jordan effect. You get the person who was spectacular and had tons of spectacular moments and iconic moments and scenarios in their career, but they were extremely consistent as well. I mean, he posted offensively, defensively, and he also produced championships regularly. And he played for a while. And you see someone who's consistent like that with also expressing spectacular performances or moments, then you get that magical existence. You get that iconic name that I just dropped, and you can see that Wayne Gretzky is that, right? Obviously Michael Jordan is that, Tom Brady is that. These are across different sport avenues. Michael Phelps was that. And you see these people who have been both. And I think that is the point. And I think to Nick's second part of his question, when he asked, is it possible to embody both? He says, in other words, if the aim is optimal expression, is it better to be spectacular or consistent? I think if the aim is optimal expression, so I'm leaving now the high performance part. Let's get into just in general. Let's talk about all of us. Let's wipe the athlete thing clean. Let's think about this. If the aim is optimal expression, is it better to be spectacular or consistent? I think if the optimal expression, then you need to embody both. I think that both need to happen. I think spectacular is a byproduct of consistency, because you can have that flash in the pan, that one-hit wonder, that viral clip, and you can be noticed and you can be recognized and you can have all this notoriety. But the consistency gives you the reps and the play-in attempts, if you will, to have multiple spectacular events. And from all the artists that I've met across any disciplines, they get really quickly, they get over their spectacular events. They don't stay on those things and highlight them for years afterwards. They're always moving forward. And so I think that you would want, as your baseline, you would want to be consistent, and you would want to have the amount of, we'll call it tokens or something in the ring is what's happening in my head right now. You don't want to have enough tokens in the slot to be able to pull off spectacular more than once. And I think that as that happens, then you've embodied both and you've reached optimal expression. But I think optimal expression is a pursuit of a lifetime. And I don't think that, obviously there's a lifetime as a sports life, and then there's a lifetime as your actual life and your career life, and your family life, your individual life. And I think optimal expression is what we're always seeking. And to seek that, we should pursue consistency and our ability to self-master ourselves. And in the pursuit of that, if we're super close and unique to ourselves, as I've already talked about in the show, then I think that we have our spectacular moments along the way. And I don't think that we have super high highs and then followed lows after that. I think that we just run the course, sort of even keeled, if you will, and then we have our spectacular moment, and we just come back to the course. And we go back on the course and we have our spectacular moment, and then we just have our course. And then actually, as I say that, that's like what it's like writing a book. Because you have, in order to write a book, you have to be consistent. And from my two experiences so far, I haven't had many, but of my two experiences of books, really the only euphoric, spectacular moment of them is like the week that they release and everyone fills your ego and talks highly of you and congratulates you, but then it just dies off and you have to go write another book. And the consistency, the pain of consistency is the personal spectacular, but your ego gets spectacular when you release it and people externally get it. And I think that takes me into the last part. Do you feel we, society, overvalue the spectacular relative to the consistent? Well, if I stay in the same vein of the book concept, I think that we only see at the surface the spectacular. And I think that, of course, we overvalue spectacular relative to consistent, because there's no incentive to really be consistent as far as I can tell, especially in the current landscape of society. We look at the urge to be virally famous and to reach stardom and money and material things. And I know I'm saying that negatively. I don't mean to. I'm just trying to think of it as what we consider living right now. That's a lot of what our aim is. Our aim is to create spectacular so that we can get material things to hopefully avoid our suffering. And so because of that, I think I don't think it's our fault individually. I think it's the way the system is set up and the structure is set up, and we just play within the structure. So even if you think about it as a fan or somebody who watches people, we are easier to idolize something or somebody rather than admire something or somebody. And what I mean by that is we idolize things and people. This is my perspective. I think that we do that more than admire, because when we're in a state of admiration, we don't compare necessarily. We see something that we see in ourselves, and we usually find ourselves admiring others because of their consistency. I think of the greatest leaders, teachers and coaches I've been around, and people and friends. They're very consistent. Now, sure, they'll have spectacular moments along the way, but they're very consistent in their obedience to morality, their obedience to their value systems, which is in the same vein. They're very consistent to their health. They're very consistent in their gratitude and their humility. And that's not as sexy as the spectacular moments. And I don't think it's hard to tell and see things that instantly blow up around us. I think a lot of things happen so quickly, and the incentive of the system that we play in incentivizes us to overvalue spectacular relative to the consistent. But I don't think on an individual basis, people would disagree with me. I just think on a large scale basis, that's how we as society value spectacular versus consistent. Like I said, in a small group setting, I think a lot of people would highly agree or believe that being consistent is the key and the point, and morality is very important, and being obedient to certain principles is very important. I don't think that's deniable. I think when we talk large scale, it's harder to talk about that, and it's harder to see that because you can't see that in the moment. I don't even know if that's possible. I don't know how you would be able to justify 30 years worth of consistency in an Instagram post or a YouTube clip or a movie or anything like that. You just can't do it. And that's just the reason why I bring up the books, is that people hold on to a book that I get, and it feels good when they applaud me and they praise me and they give me those sort of things. It feels better when they admire, and I can and be humble. I think that's because there's a select few people who you can be around who appreciate the pain that took into building something. And I wouldn't even know how that happens. I just think that that's a unique position to be in. And I think that that's the point I'm thinking of right now, is that it does look spectacular on the surface when a book comes out, because it looks cool and it's cool to read, and people are proud to know you, and that is a cool moment. But no one's with you for the year of isolation and consistency, and we're not even really talking about that. And even if I tried to explain what that's like, I can't. So yeah, I think that would be my answer to that. When I think of, so Nick, you're the man. Let me know what you think. You're probably, when you listen to this, I can't wait to get on the phone with you and chop it up. Or maybe I'll get to see you in person and we can communicate on it more. Phenomenal question. Love to get your guys' feedback on it, what your thoughts are on it, and we can move from there. As I wrap up, I know I lied to you guys. I got to have one more. My throat's a little dry here. The desert gets me. But as I wrap up the show with you guys, let's dive into the question that's coming up. So question coming up. This is this is coming from Portland. I'll save the name for the next show. But this one's coming from Portland. I love it. We got Minnesota, California, and Oregon. 3 beautiful, beautiful states. Oregon's one of the coolest places I've been to. I love California, and I absolutely love Minnesota. So I love the energy of these questions. This question that I'll answer with you guys next time, excuse me. How do you get clearer on what it is you truly want and who you want to become? How do you get clear on what it is you truly want and who you want to become? That's beautiful. I would love to answer that right now. And as I won't, so that we can have some conversation on the next one, I'll let you guys chew on it with me, and we'll move forward, and we'll keep them coming. So appreciate that one out of Portland. The earlier one, spectacular versus consistent. from San Diego, and then last week's of Self-Perception out of Minnesota. A little bit of a wrap up here as we kind of close in on this show. I got a newsletter that I'm going to be having coming out with these shows in connection with not only a moment with Mart, but then with me personally in these solo shows, but also when I have guests. So we'll have some stuff with the guests coming in. I had Big J Swish, Jordan Schmaltzy, unbelievable dude, 93.1, the fella. He was on with me, and he'll be the leadoff hitter for the 2025 rollout as some of these guests start coming in. And you guys get to know some of the people that I love having conversations with. And they're just fascinating people. Jay Swish is one of them. I've known him for a long time. He said we started training in 2017, which sounds so early to me. I think he was with the Blues at the time when I met him. I'm not sure. He was a first-round pick out of North Dakota, was in the NHL age 22, 23. Brother plays currently in the NHL for the Utah Hockey Club, was with the Coyotes. Just a cool group of dudes and great people. The hockey community is so fun, and I was so grateful that I was able to work with them for so many years. And he was one of his, as you will hear, he considered himself Mount Rushmore. So he was one of the founding OGs of the guys that I was able to work with. Other than that, look for Jay Swish coming up. We'll get that question to you guys next time and my thoughts around it. And I hope today's show was able to help you guys build a foundation and understanding around breathing and some of the ways that created my momentum and my mission behind that last book. So there we have it. I've kind of talked to you guys about my first 2 books and these first 2 shows, and it is cool to continue riding along with you guys. Enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers.